Hey there folks, Bryce Holdaway, Ben Kingsley. We are the hosts of The Property Couch and we thought we'd come to you today live to answer some questions that we get, Ben.
Yes, what have we got today, Bryce?
We are going to map it out and draw one today, which is a little bit of a unique approach for us.
Sure.
Which is pretty cool. But I've got one here from Sally Ben.
Yes.
Hi Bryce and Ben. We are wanting to help our children to get into the property market, even especially as the market is down.
Right.
I might suggest New South Wales. Ben.
Yeah, well, or when the email was generated.
No, this is fresh.
This is fresh. Okay.
But are wondering how to do this. If we have a loan approved from equity in our house and we purchase the house for them and they pay the loan, etc., can we later transfer the ownership to them? Or do we have to officially sell it to them and pay stamp duty again? Thanks, Sally. What a good question, Ben.
It's a good question. Do you want to start off in terms of explaining how that all works, Bryce?
Here's one I prepared earlier. How to help kids get on the property ladder is the question here. So what we're proposing, Ben,
yes,
is Sally saying they've got their house.
Yep.
They have already got, did they say what
equity?
It is?
Yep, so they've released equity. So
there's an equity release going here. So they have a facility in place that they can then use to buy a property over here for the kids.
Yep.
Which it depends from the way they framed up that question, the way that you framed up that question, Sally, is it sounds like you are going to have your name on the title here, allow the kids to live in it, and then the kids would be paying back not only, let's call it 80%, but the 25%, which is the deposit plus costs over here. And ultimately your question is, can you do that in a way that at some point in time, once they've paid back, say, this portion here, can they have ownership of the property? The question is, yes, they can. However, the transfer from your name to your kid's name at whatever point in time is a stamp duty event.
Correct.
It's a stamp duty event. So the way that you've structured that up would suggest that it's a good way to get them onto the property ladder. However, there are stamp duty ramifications, Ben. There is a better way, isn't there?
Well, there is. I mean, and in clarifying what Sally's asking also is, effectively the parents are going to be on title. So the title actually sits with the parents under that model. So if you're going to release that equity and go over there and buy a house outright, parents are on title. So, and then that's the transfer. Now, there's every chance that you could say, well, the parents want to buy it 50-50 or 75-35, 25, whatever that looks like in terms of that. So how we would suggest you're going to do it if ultimately you want the children to own the property is this. So here are the kids. So the kids are down here. Okay, here they are. All right, here we go. And what we're trying to do with the kids here is to sort of say they want to buy this property over here, right? So this is the property that we're going to buy. Now we could be buying it for owner-occupied purposes, or in some cases we can even do this for investment purposes. Now, to buy that property, we know it's going to cost around 106%. I'll round it up a little bit higher, right? So what is that? That's the purchase price plus costs. So you've got stamp duty and so forth. Solicitors fees, all those types of things. Now, in terms of the kids, what we're saying to them is that if they can service that debt, so they've got a nice big servicing capability to service the whole 106%, then technically, we could then go to the parents and say, hey, we have the servicing capability, but we don't necessarily have the deposit. So if we don't have the deposit, that would mean that we need to find that deposit from somewhere else. Now, where are we going to find that deposit? Potentially as what Bryce drew here, which is the 25%. So that 25% becomes a limited guarantee. In terms of how that would look, that's a limited guarantee, but it's supporting the children to own that property. Now, they might be able to then do the 80% loan. And so what happens here is the bank says, thank you. So the bank will take 80% against this property, and then they'll take a limited guarantee against this security over here, which means that they'll be able to get that full amount for the kids to be able to go in there. Now, what does that mean, Bryce? Well, who owns the property? You show them, Bryce. The people who own the property is going to be the kids over here.
Yeah, and what we talked about before, that stamp duty issue under the first scenario wouldn't be an issue under the scenario that you talked about there. A couple of things to think about here too, Ben. Not all banks will do what you've just described there. So you need to talk to the bank and see if they're open to that. Secondly, if your parents are providing a security that is in excess, so let's say this house was worth $450, but you wanted to help them buy something for 1.2, that can be a challenge, because if the security being offered is too large a percentage of the mum and dad's house, that can be an issue. And also, if your parents are retired and they are on, say, an age pension, for example, that is something that the bank will take into account. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is what you're talking about here, Sally, because from what you put in the question, it sounds like you don't qualify for a couple of those things. But one thing to do is talk to the bank and see if they can do, if they can offer what Ben has talked about. Because if they can't, you might have to talk to another lender.
Yeah, and then what happens over time is the value of this property. So as the value of that asset grows over time, then technically we would release that limited guarantee. So the guarantee is only applicable whilst the loan or the value of the property is greater than 80% of that value. So as it grows up, and then the value of the asset, the value of the property is greater than 80%, then ultimately, I should say less than 80%, then that means we can release this guarantee. So the parents are then released of that guarantee. Now, when you do get a guarantee loan, it just means that the parents have to get independent legal and financial advice so they understand their obligations, because remember, if the kids go rogue, then ultimately the parents are going to be responsible for servicing that debt. And the last thing we would want to see is a situation where the parents would have to sell that property because they weren't able to service it. So first port of call is obviously to sell this property and then take those proceeds to repay the bank if something goes horribly wrong. But otherwise, the parents can obviously use that to service that. And if they do have to sell that property, then that is a horror situation. But it shouldn't get to that. Most of the time, it's pretty easy in terms of understanding how that works. Now, another scenario that Sally may have, because we only had a limited question there, is that they don't have any deposit at all, okay? And they're sort of saying to themselves, so the kids can't even play this game. They don't even have servicing. So they might be at university. And I see this a lot, where a lot of parents decide that they go and buy a property in a city location, like an apartment, and they're justifying it because, oh, it's somewhere for the kids to stay whilst they're doing uni. Now, that apartment may not necessarily be the best use of your money, so you want to be careful with that in regards to what that looks like. But if the kids can't service the loan, so if they don't have servicing, then the reality is that the parents are going to have to do exactly what they said they were going to do, which was they're going to release an amount of equity. So remember, we always go value whatever existing debt they have against that and then release that equity. They would release that equity and they could potentially buy that property outright or release a portion of equity against this property, and then the remainder of the security will be that new property that they buy.
So let's recap, Ben. How do you help your kids get onto the property ladder? Under the scenario that Sally's talked about, is they were going to buy it themselves, let the kids live in it, and then have them service the loan. We talked about that would have stamp duty ramifications if you're down the track and you want to transfer it over to the kids. We talked about an alternative where you might be able to provide some form of guarantee so that your kids can actually buy in their own right, so that you're providing security so that they can get in, so that stamp duty event doesn't necessarily happen for them. And then the third thing we just talked about is, okay, what if your kids aren't in a position where they can secure lending? Well, then you'd have to revert back to plan A and go through this scenario. And you would go back to the original question, would stamp duty apply? Yes, they would. So there you have it, folks. Hopefully that's given you a little bit of insights as to how you might be able to help your kids get onto the property ladder.
Yeah, and there's a lot of information online which you can find in terms of fact sheets around what is parental guarantees. Have a read of those, and I'd always say, seek out some professional guidance and advice from your mortgage broker or your lender, because ultimately there are a few moving parts when it comes to this type of program of works. So it's important that you understand your rights, responsibilities and obligations So get some help along the way.
Very well said, Ben. So if you have a question that you would like us to dissect on the whiteboard here, why don't you leave us a little comment below, and we will cover that in an upcoming Facebook Live. But until this Thursday at 3 p.m, Ben, when we release our next property podcast,
Yes,
you can check us. You can?
you can.
You can check us out at thepropertycouch.com.au.